Mexican influence on jazz culture in New Orleans. To start off, during the 19th century, music was one of the ways that many people, such as Creoles, escaped from racism and unjust treatment that they had received even though they were free slaves. Louisiana was one of the main headquarters for talented musicians to gather and create a type of music called jazz. Their biggest inspiration was from Latin cultures such as Mexico, where many Creoles moved to and learned a different type of music and brought this new sound along with new types of instruments from Mexico and Louisiana and revealed a new historic genre of music. To understand the present, we obviously have to understand the past. And understanding the complex history of New Orleans is essential into understanding how jazz music was developed. New Orleans was founded in 1718 as part of the French Louisiana colony. Louisiana territories were then seceded to Spain in 1763, returned back to France in 1803, and were almost immediately sold to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase. The complex background of the people living in Louisiana created the Creole culture that dominated the Louisiana region. Catholic and French-speaking with a liberal outlook prevailed, along with an appreciation of good food, wine, of course music, and dancing. Influence of the World's Cotton Exposition of 1844. The main purpose of the World's Cotton Exposition of 1844 was to commemorate the first shipment of cotton from the U.S. to England. The main theme was cotton, of course, and its various industrial and commercial uses. But this cotton exposition also showcased artistic productions of Latin American countries and small-time Mexican bands. Porfirio Diaz, who was the president/dictator of Mexico at the time, pushed to have an octagonal-shaped Moorish-style building to be created in the exposition to exhibit Mexican culture through music and clothing and jewelry. The Cotton Exposition was also one of the most influential times in Mexican music history because this is where Juan Benito Rojas became famous for his Sobre las Olas waltz, which would be a staple in the jazz community for years to come. The Clave of Jazz. Jelly Roll Morton, 1890 to 1941, was the first accomplished composer in which he described the early period of jazz to have a Spanish tinge sound. Morton believed that if music did not have this Spanish tinge, it should not be considered jazz. The four countries that mainly brought this sound were Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Cuba. Young trumpet players like Joe King Oliver and Louis Armstrong began playing in small brass bands and would mainly play in funerals. Louis Armstrong is credited with creating the persuasive Cuban beat to the big band instrumentation known as cubop. New Orleans seemed to have been separated from the rest of the United States. It reflected its musical expression to the Caribbean, which provided a temporary safe place from discrimination and racism. New Orleans became a big point in history where events and circumstances would converge to create something new. New Orleans had a lot of refugees from all over Latin America and other types of living closely with one another, sharing musical ideas, experiences, which helped create and master the music of jazz. Latin tinge. Afro-Cuban and Afro-Mexicans at first were only allowed to play music on Sundays in the Congo Square in New Orleans. Their music transformed from ragtime music to jazz music. Jelly Roll Morton was a piano jazz player who was influenced by Cuban music with a Havana rhythm and Spanish tinge. Trumpet players such as Mario Baluauza and Dizzy Gillespie added a Cuban style of music to jazz. Cuban musicians joined the jazz scene in New Orleans during the late 1800s. Mario Bauza and Frank Grillo created a band named Machito. Some other instruments introduced to jazz from Latin America were the tamborando and the bongo. Congo Square. Creoles were of great influence in jazz music because of their mixed race and Afro-Mexican contributions. Creoles had more privileges than African Americans, but after the enactment of Jim Crow laws, Creoles lost their status, leading to the coalition of their traditions. Since uptown black people had different ways of learning music, they offered a new way of playing than Creoles did. Just like Creoles, African Americans became an important part of the creation of jazz music because of their shared race. As a result of the Congo Square, it became one of the most influential places for African Americans and Creoles to develop their musical skills and their dances as well. Early jazz was developed during the racial segregation in which white musicians could enjoy freedom that was denied to black musicians. Those black musicians uptown learned the music by ear and were known for playing improvised blues. They were descendants of enslaved people from the city. During this period, we have a cotton expedition in the year 1884, and in 1898, the Cuban and Spanish-American War in the Storyville. During the Storyville, musicians such as King Oliver performed New Orleans jazz and at the same time dances. New Orleans becomes the home to many jazz musicians from different cities due to the social advancement and economic opportunities. Later in the year 1925, record companies began their trips to New Orleans to record local bands and profit off of jazz music. Joe King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band was one of the most famous and important early jazz bands. King Oliver was a Creole who came to New Orleans from the South Louisiana sugarcane plantations. He traveled to New Orleans when he was for more economic opportunities and social advancements. During his childhood, he was raised by his sister because both of his parents had passed away. In interviews, King Oliver mentions how difficult the evolution of jazz was due to the circumstances of both the Civil War and post-Civil War. Yet his experiences and practice is what made him one of the most important individuals, since he is a figurehead for Creole jazz bands. During the same interview, Oliver says that I may not have had a mentor, but I was a mentor to many people, showing that an African American / Creole man could have great influence on those around him. It is important to see the evolution of jazz from the influence of Latin American countries because it shows how people, especially minorities, have the ability to find common ground and come together. The South was a harsh place to live for anyone of color during this time period. People were able to feel free from their conditions, kick back, relax, and enjoy themselves. Jazz has the ability to inspire and change the U.S. for the better.